Baby girl found a German shepherd carrying a baby blanket. What happened next melted hearts. Some stories defy logic and others defy expectations. What this child did next will shatter your understanding of love and loyalty. A bond so deep, it saved a life. Like, share, and subscribe. This is the story you'll be talking about long after it ends. The morning had begun like any other in the quiet little town. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, birds chirped softly from the rooftops, and the smell of fresh bread from the local bakery drifted down the street. Children's laughter was faint in the distance, and a gentle breeze swayed the flowers that lined the picket fences. It was the kind of morning that felt safe, predictable, almost ordinary. In the middle of this calm stood a little girl, no more than 4 years old, giggling as she played in her front yard. She chased the butterflies that fluttered over her mother's rose bushes, her small shoes crunching on the gravel path. Her world was simple, filled with toys, laughter, and the endless curiosity only children possess. Nothing in that moment hinted that she was about to witness something that would stir the hearts of an entire community. As she paused to catch her breath, her bright eyes wandered down the lane. That was when she saw it, a figure moving slowly, steadily. At first, it looked like an ordinary dog, wandering the street as stray dogs often did. But there was something unusual about this one. Its steps were heavy, deliberate, almost protective, as if every motion carried a secret. The little girl tilted her head and blinked against the sun. Her tiny hands clutched the fence rail as she leaned forward. It wasn't just any dog. It was a German shepherd, tall, noble, and strong, yet its face seemed weighed down by something unspoken. And then she noticed what made her heart skip a beat. Hanging gently from his mouth, dragging along the ground, was not a stick, not food, not even a toy, but a small baby blanket. The fabric was worn, edges frayed, its soft pastel colors faded with time. Damp from the morning dew, it dragged across the dusty road, gathering dirt as the shepherd carried it carefully, as though it were made of glass. His jaw was firm but gentle, not a single thread of the blanket torn by his teeth. It was as if he knew its value, not as cloth, but as memory. The girl's laughter faded, replaced by wide-eyed wonder. She pressed her tiny hand to her chest, sensing something her young mind couldn't fully explain. Why was the dog carrying a baby blanket? Where did it come from? And why did he walk as though he was on a mission no one else could understand? The shepherd stopped a few feet away, lifting his eyes toward her. In them, she didn't see the wildness of a stray or the threat of danger. She saw something different: sorrow, loyalty, and an unshakable devotion to whatever that blanket represented. The silence between them felt heavy, yet filled with meaning. For a moment, it was as if time itself paused. Her innocent gaze locked on the dog's burden, and in that instant, the world around her shifted. To anyone else, it might have been just an odd sight, a dog with a piece of cloth. But to her it was more. That blanket wasn't just fabric. It was a story waiting to be told, a mystery wrapped in loyalty and love. And though she didn't know it yet, what she saw that morning would ripple far beyond her own home. That single moment, a baby girl noticing a dog carrying a blanket, would soon touch the hearts of her parents, her neighbors, and eventually the entire town. Because sometimes, the smallest eyes see what the rest of the world has forgotten to notice. The town was still stretching awake beneath the soft glow of the rising sun. A thin mist clung to the edges of the gardens, shimmering like a veil as it slowly lifted from the grass. Rows of small homes lined the street, each with its own charm. White picket fences with peeling paint, flower pots balanced on windowsills, and wind chimes that tinkled whenever the breeze wandered by. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew one another's names, where neighbors waved from porches, and where the sound of children's laughter often traveled farther than the postman's whistle. That morning carried with it the kind of peace that felt timeless. Sparrows hopped along telephone wires, chirping to one another. A pair of robins pecked the wet ground for worms after last night's drizzle. On the corner, old Mr. Grayson could be seen tending his rose bushes, carefully clipping away the wilted petals as though each bloom was a precious jewel. From one of the houses down the street, the aroma of fresh pancakes drifted out, making the air sweeter than it already was. In one yard, surrounded by a wooden fence just tall enough to feel safe, a little girl played freely. She was a toddler, no more than 4, with wide eyes that caught everything around her: the colors of the flowers, the shapes of the clouds, the movement of ants on the sidewalk. To her, the world was a place of endless wonder. Her toys were scattered in the grass: a tiny red wagon, a stuffed bear missing one ear, and a bucket filled with dandelions she had carefully plucked from the lawn. She laughed with delight as she tossed petals into the air, watching them drift like golden snowflakes. Her mother watched from the porch, sipping tea, her heart at ease. This was the childhood she had always hoped her daughter would know: safe, playful, untouched by worry. And the girl, lost in her little world, seemed to carry that innocence in every movement. She hummed a tune she had picked up from a lullaby, her voice soft, almost blending with the rustle of the trees. But in the midst of this picture-perfect morning, something unusual stirred. At first, it was only a shadow at the far end of the lane, a figure moving slowly, steadily. The little girl's eyes, always curious, caught the sight before anyone else. She paused in her play, her tiny hands resting on the fence rail as she leaned forward, squinting into the sunlight. There, walking along the cracked pavement, was a German shepherd. Its large frame and steady gait stood out immediately against the backdrop of small-town calm. Unlike the stray dogs she had sometimes seen darting across yards or rummaging through bins, this one did not rush or wander aimlessly. He walked with purpose, his head lowered, his steps heavy yet certain, as though he was following a path only he could see. The girl tilted her head, fascinated. To her young eyes, animals were not just creatures, they were characters, each with their own stories. This dog did not look wild, nor did he look careless. Instead, there was something almost solemn about him, something that made her heart grow quiet as she watched. And then she noticed it. Trailing from his mouth was not a stick, nor food, nor a toy. It was a piece of fabric, soft, worn, and pale in color. The cloth dragged gently along the ground, gathering tiny bits of dust as the dog walked. At first, the girl thought it might be a rag or perhaps part of someone's laundry. But the closer the shepherd drew, the clearer it became. It was a blanket. A baby blanket. The fabric was damp, as though it had been caught in last night's rain. Its edges were frayed, threads hanging loose like whispers of a forgotten past. Despite its condition, the dog held it carefully, his jaws firm but gentle, not tearing a single thread. Each step he took seemed deliberate, as if carrying that blanket was not just an action, it was a mission. The girl's eyes widened. To anyone else, it might have looked strange but insignificant, a stray dog carrying something he had found. But to her, with her pure and unfiltered gaze, it was extraordinary. She could sense the weight of it, not just the fabric, but the meaning it seemed to hold. The way the dog's eyes flickered with determination, the way he refused to let the cloth go, gave her the unshakable feeling that this was more than chance. She pressed her tiny fingers against the fence and whispered, almost to herself, "He's carrying a memory." Her mother, too far away to hear or notice what had captured her daughter's attention, simply smiled as the little one leaned closer. But for the girl, the world had shifted. In that moment, her toys, her petals, her wagon, all of it faded into the background. The dog and his fragile burden became the center of her universe. The shepherd continued on, the blanket trailing softly behind him, catching in the breeze. And though the morning was bright and peaceful, a question lingered in the air, a question that would soon draw not just the girl, but her entire town, into a story none of them could forget. The little girl couldn't look away. Her tiny hands still clutched the fence rail as her wide eyes followed every step the German Shepherd took. The morning sun lit his coat in shades of brown and black, glinting off the raindrops that still clung to his fur. He didn't rush, didn't stray, didn't falter. And all the while, he carried that soft bundle of cloth with a quiet determination that was impossible to ignore. Curiosity bubbled up inside her. With the innocence only a child could possess, she slipped through the small opening in the gate and padded onto the walkway, her little shoes making light tapping sounds on the pavement. Her mother, still sipping tea, didn't notice at first. The girl's world was alive with wonder, and the dog had become the mystery she simply had to solve. As she moved closer, the details of the fabric became clearer. It wasn't just any cloth. It was unmistakably a baby blanket. Its faded pastel colors suggested it had once been pink or maybe a soft yellow, now dulled by time and dampness. The edges were frayed, threads curling outward like delicate tendrils. A small embroidered corner revealed a faint design, a teddy bear stitched in light brown thread, its smile faded but still visible. The girl's nose wrinkled slightly as she drew in the scent. Despite the dampness, there was something faint, something familiar. It smelled of warmth, of milk, of powder, the scent of a baby that lingered long after the child had grown. The German Shepherd stopped for a moment in the middle of the street, his ears twitching as though he was listening to something unseen. His stance was protective, strong yet weary, as if he had been carrying this burden for far longer than anyone realized. The blanket hung from his mouth like a sacred object, not drooping carelessly but held with the utmost care. Every motion he made suggested intention. He wasn't dragging trash. He wasn't scavenging. He was carrying something important. The little girl's heart stirred in a way she didn't quite understand. At her age, the world was still divided into simple categories: playful things and scary things, safe places and unsafe ones. Dogs, especially big ones, often belonged in the scary category when strangers were involved. She had seen other kids cry or hide when large dogs barked or came too close. But this moment felt different. Where others might have taken a step back, she took a step forward. Her amazement grew as she studied the shepherd's face. His eyes weren't wild or threatening. They were deep pools of patience, glistening with something far gentler than ferocity. In them, she didn't see danger, she saw purpose. He glanced at her once, a brief flick of his gaze, and though his jaw never loosened around the fabric, she could swear there was something protective in that look. Her curiosity bloomed into something tender, something she couldn't name. She tilted her head, watching him, and felt a strange heaviness in her small chest. It was as though she had stumbled upon a secret meant only for her, a sacred truth adults might miss. The shepherd wasn't just a dog carrying a blanket. He was a guardian of something unseen, a protector of a story untold. She whispered softly, her voice barely louder than the breeze. Where others might have seen a stray, I see a guardian carrying someone's story. The words came without thought, pure and unshaped, but they hung in the air like a fragile thread of truth. The German Shepherd shifted his stance, tightening his hold on the blanket, and continued on. His paws made wet prints on the pavement, a trail that spoke of both weariness and resilience. And with every step he took, the girl followed, her little legs quickening to keep up. She didn't know why, but she couldn't let him out of her sight. The houses on either side of the street blurred into the background. For her, there was only the dog and the strange, powerful mystery he carried. The faint smell of the blanket lingered in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of damp grass and rain-soaked soil. To the girl, it was like following a ribbon of memory, one she didn't fully understand but somehow felt was important. When the shepherd paused again near a cluster of lilac bushes by the corner, she stopped too. She crouched down just a few feet away, studying the fabric more closely. The blanket looked fragile, as though it could unravel at any moment. Yet it was carried with such care that not a thread had been torn, not a stitch undone. It was as if the dog knew its worth better than anyone else could. The girl hugged her stuffed bear to her chest, suddenly feeling a pang of connection. She knew what it was to love something soft, something that brought comfort. To her, the shepherd's devotion to the blanket wasn't strange at all. It was beautiful. Her mother's voice called faintly from the porch, breaking the spell for just a moment. But the girl didn't answer right away. She was still caught in the quiet magic of the scene before her. And in that instant, as sunlight filtered through the clouds and lit the shepherd's face, she understood something beyond her years. This was no ordinary morning and no ordinary sight. The dog wasn't lost. He wasn't scavenging. He was holding on to something precious, something that mattered. The girl rose slowly, her small heart brimming with amazement and tenderness. Whatever story the shepherd carried, she knew deep down she had just become part of it. The little girl spun on her heels and sprinted back toward the gate, her pigtails flying like small flags in the morning air. "Mama," she called, breathless, as her shoes thumped up the path. "Mama, come. The dog has a blanket." Her mother, halfway through folding laundry on the porch swing, blinked over the rim of a coffee mug. "A blanket," she repeated, smiling the way grown-ups do when a child says something delightful and impossible. "Sweetheart, dogs don't carry." "They do," the girl insisted, tugging at her mother's sleeve with both hands. "He's got a baby blanket. He's saving it." Across the fence, the German shepherd had stopped beneath the lilac bushes and settled his paws in the shape of a small shield, the faded cloth pulled carefully between them like a treasure he feared the breeze might steal. He didn't chew. He didn't play. He only watched, eyes steady, ears turning with the faintest sounds of the street, as though the blanket could speak and he was its interpreter. Her mother set the mug aside, still humoring, still disbelieving, and followed her daughter to the gate. When she saw the dog, and the pale, worn square of fabric cradled in his mouth, her smile slipped. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh." By then, Mrs. Alvarez from next door had appeared at her hedgerow, a watering can dangling from her hand, the scent of mint rising where she'd brushed the herb with her sleeve. "Is that the shepherd again?" she asked, squinting. "He came through last week after the rain. Good-natured. Why's he, is that a blanket?" the mother whispered, more to herself than anyone else, as if naming it made the moment more real. "Dogs don't carry blankets," Mrs. Alvarez declared, because that was the rule she had always known. But her voice lacked conviction. The sight refused to fit inside the rule. The little girl slipped through the gate before anyone could stop her and padded across the sidewalk, small steps slow and careful, the way one approaches fireflies. The shepherd lifted his gaze, met her eyes, and, without flinching, without growling, returned his attention to the bundle. He shifted an inch, enough to curve his tail around the cloth. A guardrail of fur. "Come back, honey," her mother called, not stern so much as gentle with a tremor underneath. "Let's give him space." But space did not feel like the truth. The truth wore a threadbare edge and smelled faintly of baby powder and rain. The truth pooled between the shepherd's paws, and the child's curiosity anchored her there. Across the street, Mr. Green the mailman slowed his cart and stepped off the curb. Two teenagers on skateboards rolled to a stop by the oak tree and pulled out their phones. A jogger looped her earbuds around her fingers and joined the semicircle that formed without planning, the way people gather to watch a first snowfall. In minutes, the quiet block hummed with whispers. "Whose dog is that? Whose blanket is that? Maybe he found it in the trash. He's not playing with it. Look how he holds it. The shepherd did not bare his teeth. He did not bolt. He did not so much as glance at the meat Mr. Green offered from his lunch pail. He drew the blanket closer when hands reached and relaxed only when the hands retreated, and the small voice, the one that had called him guardian with its silence, stood near. He seemed to understand the boundaries of fear and kindness and to place himself exactly on the line where trust might be negotiated. The girl's father, summoned by a neighbor's knock, came out tying his robe. He was practical, the kind who fixed leaky faucets and kept the ladder oiled, and practicality reached for a solution. "Maybe it's some dog's toy," he suggested. "Maybe it just looks like a blanket." But even as he said it, the shepherd lifted his head and the embroidery flashed, the faint teddy bear stitched into the satin corner, a smile worn down but still tender. This was no toy. It had once warmed a sleeping chest and tucked under a small chin. It carried a story in every fray. "Why won't he drop it?" the jogger asked, her voice a notch above a whisper, as if loudness might snap the fragile spell. "Because it matters," the little girl said, with the certainty only a child can summon. She sat on her heels, hands folded in her lap, as if taking a seat in a pew. The shepherd's ear twitched toward her. He exhaled, slow as a sigh, and the blanket rose and fell with his breath. No one could agree on what to do. Some thought to call animal control. Others argued for the shelter, the vet, a rescue. Suggestions stacked like bricks, useful in their way, but none fit the shape of the moment. The dog made no move to run, and yet he was not tame. He carried the blanket not as a possession but as a promise. "I think he's waiting," Mrs. Alvarez murmured, surprising herself with the softness in her voice. She had raised children and then grandchildren. She had folded 100 blankets into cedar chests. She knew the weight of fabric that remembered lullabies. For who, I don't know. But look at him. He's keeping watch. The idea passed from mouth to mouth, a hush traveling with it. Waiting. The word soothed and unsettled at once. Waiting requires time, and time requires patience, and patience requires belief that what you protect is worth the hours you spend. The little girl inched closer until she could see the pattern where the satin trim had been rubbed smooth by small, sleepy fingers. She had a blanket like that once. Her mother had washed it so many times the color ran like watercolor into the sink. Seeing this one, this stranger's, felt like meeting a long-lost cousin. "Can I see it?" she asked the shepherd, not reaching, only asking, the way polite people do at a museum. He blinked. His paws did not shift, but the grip of his jaw loosened, not enough to surrender, enough to show he had heard. He angled the corner toward her, an offering measured in millimeters. She smiled and did not move. Trust, she seemed to understand, happens in the tiny arithmetic of inches. Behind them, the street made room for the moment. Footsteps slowed. Doors stayed open. Even the birds, noisy in the hydrangea hedge, seemed to lower their chatter. It was the stillness of a chapel before the first note of a hymn. "Dogs don't carry blankets," someone said again, not to argue, but to marvel at how a rule could crumble under the weight of an exception. "Maybe," her father said, hands on his hips, "he's bringing it back, like a lost thing." Or keeping it safe, her mother offered, eyes shining. "Until someone comes who knows what it means." The shepherd's gaze lifted to the end of the street where the road curved toward the old playground and the small brick clinic beyond. He stared at it as if counting. As if, any minute now, a figure might appear who had been missing from the story so far. Then he lowered his head and rested his chin on the blanket, a posture of solemn pledge. Neighbors tried names: Buddy, Max, Rex. Softly, experimentally, the way you hold shells to your ear to hear the sea. None broke the spell. A name, the little girl thought, would come later. First came listening. Her mother crouched at last beside her, the fence between them forgotten. "We can't take it from him," she said gently, "but we can sit. We can wait with him." And so the block, accustomed to hurry and schedules and lists, discovered how to linger. Someone brought a bowl of water and slid it forward. The dog gulped thirstily, then nudged the blanket back under his chin, as if worried it would wander off if not anchored by his breath. Someone else set down a shallow tray with slices of turkey, but he only ate when the little girl whispered, "It's okay," and even then he chewed around the fabric, refusing to dampen more than the edge he already held. The symbolism was not lost, even on those who did not speak it aloud. A protector holding onto something fragile because the world is not always kind to small, soft things. A keeper of stories waiting at a threshold between loss and return. In the shepherd's stillness, in the way he curved himself around the cloth and measured strangers by the tone of their voices, the neighborhood recognized a lesson it had forgotten, that sometimes strength looks like keeping watch, sometimes love looks like not letting go. The little girl glanced up at her mother, then back at the dog. "We can help," she whispered, and though her voice was tiny, it carried. Heads nodded around her as if the words had been an invitation and a command. Help didn't mean taking. It meant honoring the shape of his waiting. It meant making a circle instead of a line, warm bodies forming a gentle boundary so cars slowed and children learned to whisper. It meant calling the vet, not to seize, but to guide. It meant letting the morning pass without forcing it into neat explanations. The shepherd's eyes softened at the edges. He shifted once, twice, and then, with the care of a librarian turning a fragile page, drew the blanket closer and closed his eyes, not sleeping exactly, but resting the way sentries do, one ear always awake. By noon the rumor had traveled beyond the street. People came from 2 blocks over and then 3, not to gawk but to witness. "Have you seen him?" they asked each other, as if speaking of a comet. "The dog who keeps the blanket?" And when they arrived, they lowered their voices and took their place in the hush, because that is what one does at a vigil. The little girl stayed where she had been from the beginning, at the shepherd's side, as near as his trust would let her be. She did not reach. She did not demand. She simply kept watch with him, a child and a dog bound by the same quiet vow. And if anyone had asked her what they were waiting for, she would not have known how to answer. Only that the waiting felt holy. Only that the blanket had a story and, until the right person came to finish it, they would keep it safe, together. The air had shifted by the time noon gave way to afternoon. The neighborhood, once full of its ordinary rhythm, lawns being watered, children pedaling their bikes, the sound of radios drifting from kitchens, now pulsed with a different kind of energy. It wasn't noisy exactly, but it was charged with questions nobody yet knew how to answer. The German shepherd still lay beneath the lilacs, chin resting protectively on the tiny blanket. He hadn't moved much in hours. Every time someone stepped closer, his body tensed, paws curling in tighter around the fabric as though to say, "This isn't yours to take." The parents tried first. The little girl's father came out with a plate of leftover chicken, the steam curling into the air. He crouched at a cautious distance, extending his arms so the scent might drift toward the dog. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "You're hungry, aren't you? Just leave the blanket. You can eat this." But the shepherd's amber eyes flicked to the plate only for a moment, then back to the blanket. Hunger tugged at him, yet something stronger kept him anchored to the scrap of cloth. Neighbors joined in with offerings of their own: deli meat, fresh bread, even slices of cheese laid on paper towels. Mrs. Alvarez filled a bowl with warm broth, sliding it carefully toward him. "For strength, Corrito," she whispered. Still, the shepherd made no move. He licked his lips once, a reflex against temptation, but he held the blanket firmer, as if afraid kindness was just a trick to make him let go. The crowd murmured, shifting between curiosity and pity. Some shook their heads. "Strange dog," one man muttered. "Most strays would have torn that thing up by now." Another replied, softer, "He doesn't look like a stray at all. He looks like he's remembering." The little girl, who had been sitting cross-legged in the grass watching everything, finally rose to her feet. She brushed the dirt from her dress and walked toward him with the calmness of someone who had no doubt. Her mother half reached for her but didn't stop her. Something about the child's stillness quieted even adult fears. She knelt down just close enough that their eyes met again. Her voice was a feather. "It's okay," she whispered. "You don't have to be scared." The shepherd's ears twitched. He didn't release the blanket, not yet, but his jaw loosened slightly, the corners softening. He exhaled a long, tired breath that sounded like surrender to the weight of memories. The little girl tilted her head and offered her hand, palm open but not pushing. For the first time, his gaze slipped from the cloth to her tiny fingers. He didn't lick them, didn't nuzzle, but he didn't retreat either. That small allowance felt monumental. It was trust measured in inches. Whispers rippled through the neighbors. "He's listening to her. Did you see that?" He trusts the child. Her mother's throat tightened, her eyes shimmering with the truth of it. Adults had tried coaxing, bribing, reasoning, and failed. Yet all it took was the quiet assurance of a child's voice to pierce the wall he had built. It wasn't food he needed. It was faith. Still, the blanket remained in his jaws. Its faded edges hung limp, dampened by his breath. And now the questions grew heavier. Whose blanket was it? How had it come into his possession? Why guard it with such fierce devotion? Someone suggested it might belong to a family nearby, perhaps a toy stolen from a yard. Another whispered the darker possibility. Maybe it was all that remained of someone he loved. The air grew hushed at that thought, as though grief itself had settled among them. The little girl reached out slowly until her fingertips brushed the fabric. The shepherd stiffened, but she only patted the edge gently, murmuring, "It's safe. We'll help." His shoulders relaxed by a fraction. It was then the crowd understood. He wasn't being selfish, wasn't hoarding. He was protecting. Whether grieving for a child long gone or waiting for one who might return, he was guarding the last link to a love too precious to release. And in that realization, fear dissolved. No one looked at him as a threat anymore. They saw him for what he truly was, a loyal heart unwilling to let go of the past. He was not dangerous. He was broken. He was faithful. He was love itself, wrapped in fur and silence. The little girl leaned closer, her cheek nearly against the blanket now. The shepherd's eyelids lowered, and for the first time he seemed to rest, not fully, but enough that his body's constant alertness slackened. It was as if her presence gave him permission to share the burden of guarding. The neighborhood held its breath, witnessing something sacred. Where adults had failed to understand, a child's whisper had uncovered the truth. The shepherd wasn't a stray protecting fabric. He was a guardian keeping vigil over a memory. And in that moment, under the shade of lilacs and the collective gaze of neighbors, the question no longer was how to take the blanket from him. The question became, what story did this blanket hold? And who had the shepherd been waiting for all this time? By late afternoon, a white van eased to the curb, its engine cutting off with a soft cough. The logo on the side read Willow Creek Animal Rescue, and when the doors slid open, 2 volunteers stepped out carrying a kit that looked more like a first aid box than anything threatening. Behind them came a gray-haired veterinarian in rain boots and a denim jacket. She moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times and still cared every single time. "I'm Dr. Hale," she said, voice low so as not to startle the shepherd curled beneath the lilac hedge. "Who called it in?" "We did," the little girl's mother answered, lifting a hand. "He's been here for hours. He won't eat, won't move, and he won't let go of that blanket." Dr. Hale's gaze followed the mother's line of sight and softened when she saw the faded square of cloth cupped in the dog's paws. "May I?" she asked the child, not the adults. "I'm going to sit down by him, but I'll keep my hands where he can see. You stay right there. If he listens to you, that will help me." The little girl nodded solemnly, then knelt again, her tiny fingers resting on the edge of the blanket. The shepherd's ears twitched toward her like compass needles finding north. Dr. Hale lowered herself onto the grass a few feet away and began the quiet work of earning trust. Body turned sideways, eyes soft, words like water smoothing stone. "You're a good boy," she murmured. "No one's taking it away from you. We just want to make sure you're okay." A volunteer slid a bowl of water within reach. Another set a plate near the hedge and stepped back, palms open. The crowd, which had grown to the size of a small street fair, sank into a hush that felt almost like a prayer. "Do you think he's chipped?" someone whispered. "We'll find out," Dr. Hale said, lifting a small scanner from her bag. "But only if he says it's all right." It wasn't the scanner that convinced him. It was the child. She leaned close enough that the shepherd could feel the warmth of her breath on his toes, and she whispered the same thing she'd been whispering all day. "It's okay. You don't have to be scared. We'll help." The dog's jaw loosened around the cloth. He didn't release it, but he let his head lower to the grass. Dr. Hale edged forward, slow as a tide, and passed the scanner above his shoulder blades. A soft beep popped the silence. Dr. Hale's brows knit as she squinted at the tiny screen. "He is chipped," she announced, and a ripple ran through the crowd like wind through tall grass. "Registered name: Ranger. Owner: Caraway." She read an address, then blinked and looked up. "That's just 2 blocks over." 2 houses down, Mrs. Alvarez straightened, one hand flying to her throat. "Caraway?" she repeated, breath catching on the second syllable. "Oh, dear God. The Caraways." She was already moving as she spoke, and the older neighbors moved with her memory. They lived on Maple before the Thompsons. Their baby, Lily. Her voice broke on the name, and the block fell quiet enough to hear a leaf drop. The story arrived in pieces, shared by those who had been here long enough to remember. A young couple, kind and quiet. A nursery with yellow curtains. A handmade blanket gifted at the baby shower. "I made it," Mrs. Alvarez whispered, brushing the cloth's scalloped edge with trembling fingers. "See the little daisies in the stitching? I always crochet daisies for good luck." A murmur passed around the hedge. The faded cloth wasn't just any blanket, it was that blanket. The one lifted over a tiny face at dawn and tugged up under a chin at midnight. The one that soaked up first tears and warmed first naps. And one winter it had been clutched in hands that had no more mornings left. After the funeral, the Caraways had left. Some said for the city, some said for a sister's spare room, packing the house in a slow, stunned silence. Ranger had watched the crib disappear and the dresser go out sideways and the door close behind a sorrow so large it swallowed sound. In the confusion of moving and grief, he had slipped out. Or maybe he had stayed on purpose. No one knew. They only knew that after the Caraways were gone, a shepherd sometimes appeared at dusk in the yard with something soft in his mouth, sitting under the lilacs as if guarding a room that no longer existed. Dr. Hale listened while she watched Ranger. He didn't look like a dog who had been running wild. His coat, though dusty, had the ghost of past care in its sheen. He was thin but not skeletal, and the way he held the blanket, gentle and exact, the same way a careful hand carries a photograph, told its own part of the story. "I'm going to call the number on this registration," Dr. Hale said, standing only long enough to step aside and dial. Across the hedge, the little girl's mother slipped an arm around Mrs. Alvarez's shoulders. The older woman's eyes stayed on the daisies she had stitched years ago. Her lips moved as if counting the petals. A phone rang somewhere far from Maple Street, carrying the day's astonishment down a wire. When a voice answered, Dr. Hale stepped away to speak. She returned with her expression carefully arranged, respectful of the ache in the block. "I reached Mrs. Carraway," she said. "She moved 2 towns over." She cried when she heard the words Ranger and blanket. She said Ranger and Lily were inseparable. He slept under the crib. When Lily had her naps, Ranger would lie with his nose on that blanket as if he could breathe for her. Dr. Hale swallowed. After they lost her, Ranger took the blanket everywhere. He'd sit under the lilacs while Lily's mother folded laundry on the porch. When they packed to leave, he slipped away. She thought maybe he went with the movers by accident. They looked for him. For months. No one spoke for a long beat. Even the birds seemed to lower their voices. "What do we do now?" the father asked softly, as if speaking too loudly might tear something fragile. "We help him," Dr. Hale said simply. "We help him rest and we help him heal. And if Mrs. Carraway is willing, maybe she can come say goodbye or hello. Whatever they both need." The little girl had stayed with Ranger throughout the phone call, her hand on that frayed corner like an anchor. "Can he come inside?" she asked, looking up at her mother with eyes children use when they have already promised someone safety. Her mother crouched beside her. "We can bring him to the porch for now, honey. Let Dr. Hale check him first." Dr. Hale nodded approval. "If he'll walk, we'll keep the blanket with him," she said. "No taking it away. Not yet. Not at all if we can help it." She produced a soft, wide slip lead and showed it to Ranger like a polite invitation. His eyes slipped from the loop to the girl's face. She smiled and whispered, "It's okay. You can come to my house." The shepherd lifted his head. For the first time all day, he made a choice to move. He rose slowly as if waking from a long vigil. The neighbors each took a step back to open a gentle lane through the grass. Ranger kept the blanket held just tight enough. The little girl walked beside him the few short yards to the porch, a tiny escort with a serious expression, while her father cleared a space and her mother laid down a folded towel. Mrs. Alvarez fetched a bowl her late husband had used for garden tomatoes, and now it became a water dish. On the porch, Dr. Hale ran careful hands over Ranger's ribs and paws. "Mild dehydration," she murmured, "and the pads on his feet are worn. But no wounds I can feel. He's exhausted." She lifted her stethoscope. "May I?" she asked the child again. The little girl nodded. Ranger stood still for the cold bell against his chest, eyes never leaving the blanket. When the exam ended, Dr. Hale exhaled. "He's going to be okay with rest and food." She looked at the mother. "May he stay here tonight? I'll bring pain reliever for those pads and some proper food." "Of course," the mother said, voice thick. A neighbor appeared with a shallow basket lined with a clean pillowcase. "Maybe the blanket can rest in here," she suggested, placing it near Ranger's paws. The child touched the basket first, then lifted her eyebrows at Ranger as if asking permission. He lowered the cloth into the nest with a tenderness that made more than one throat catch. Then, startling everyone, he nosed the blanket toward the little girl until a corner lay in her lap. It was not surrender so much as an offering, a piece of grief shared, a tiny banner of trust. The crowd didn't clap. They were too busy brushing tears away as quietly as possible. It felt wrong to cheer something that had been born from loss. Better, instead, to bear witness to what kindness could unspool. As dusk tilted in, porch lights winked on up and down the street. Word traveled even to those who hadn't come to watch. The story was already becoming a living thing, about a dog who had kept the last soft thread of a baby's life safe between his teeth, about a neighborhood that stood still long enough to listen, and about a child whose whisper could find the crack in a wall sorrow had built. Dr. Hale gathered her kit. "I'll be back with supplies," she promised. Mrs. Carraway said she and her husband would drive over tomorrow. She asked me to tell Ranger that she never stopped looking for him. The little girl bent and whispered that into his ear herself. His tail thumped once against the porch. Beneath the lilac's purple shadow traded for the porch's warm lamplight, Ranger curled his body around the basket and laid his head across the little girl's bare toes. He kept the blanket within touching distance, but at last his eyes drifted closed. It wasn't the sleep of someone who had given up. It was the sleep of someone who, for the first time in a very long time, didn't have to keep watch alone. And in that quiet, the town felt something ease inside it, a knot loosening. The mystery of the blanket had become a bridge, not just between past and present, but between a faithful heart and a small hand that had taught it how to trust again. Morning found Ranger exactly where he had fallen asleep, curled beside the basket on the porch, the frayed blanket close enough to touch, the little girl's toes tucked against his warm flank as if they'd been keeping watch over each other all night. When the first sliver of sun slid across the white fence, he lifted his head at the soft patter of pajama feet. The girl arrived with a seriousness that belonged more to nurses than toddlers. A plastic cup of water clutched in both hands, a wobbling plate with 2 slices of ham balanced on top. Her mother hovered behind her with real breakfast and a small tub of paw balm Dr. Hale had dropped off before dawn. The balm smelled faintly of eucalyptus and hope. The mother lowered herself to the floorboards, cross-legged, and whispered, "May I?" The girl nodded and gave a tiny approving hum, which Ranger watched as closely as the mother's hands. When the cool salve met the worn pads of his paws, he didn't flinch. He let out a breath instead, long and unguarded, as if something inside him had finally decided the house had adopted him, whether or not the paperwork had caught up. They gave him a name aloud for the first time. "Ranger," the mother said gently, testing the sound, and the dog's ears tipped forward like flags at half-mast, recognizing a word that had once meant dinner and walk and good boy. The girl tried it too and giggled when his tail tapped the boards twice. She pressed her palm, sticky with jam, to his shoulder as if swearing an oath. He leaned into her, careful not to dislodge the blanket. From that morning on, he pinpointed her in every room by sound alone. The soft bump of a toy against the baseboard, the small squeak of a drawer she wasn't supposed to open, the whisper of a storybook sliding from the shelf. He matched his steps to her steps when she toddled across the grass, paused when she paused to examine a ladybug, moved forward only when she said, "Let's go, Ranja," syllables tugged apart by a toddler's mouth. News of a good dog travels faster than any storm. By lunchtime, Maple Street had become a gentle parade. Mrs. Alvarez returned with a casserole and a needlework pouch. "The edges are fraying," she said, speaking to Ranger as if he were an old neighbor. She sat on the porch steps and added 3 new daisies to the blanket's scalloped border, her needle dipping in and out with a steadiness that anchored the afternoon. From the hardware store, Mr. Patel brought a leather collar and a small brass tag he'd engraved between customers. "Ranger. If found, call Maple Street." The teenagers from the corner house, who had skated past with wary looks the day before, came back with chalk and drew a chain of daisies along the sidewalk from the gate to the porch. They left a bowl of ice at the end, which melted into a puddle the little girl splashed just to hear Ranger's soft chuff of amusement. Healing never looks like a straight line on a chart. It looks like a dog rising a little faster each day, like a child shortening the distance between her hand and his while she learns where his ribs curve and where his breath sits. It looks like the way Ranger began to eat with appetite again, first ham, then chicken, then kibble, then a bite or 2 of apple from the girl's palm. It looks like the way the porch became a station, neighbors pausing on their evening walks to scratch a shoulder, to leave a toy, to say, "We're glad you're home." It looks like Ranger's head checking the doorframe each time a new person arrived, not in suspicion, but in something like courtesy. "I see you." Come in peace." When the mailman dropped letters into the slot with a grin and an extra biscuit, Ranger didn't bark. He stood, took the biscuit, and followed the little girl to her spot by the window, where she read envelopes to him in a language built of pictures and guesswork. That night, after baths and the scrape of spoons in bowls of ice cream, after Dr. Hale returned to check Ranger's paws and left with a thumbs up, the girl's mother carried a lamp to the porch. It cast a warm circle that turned the wood golden and made the blanket's daisies glow like stars that had fallen to take a closer look. Ranger eased himself down. He was still learning how to sleep like someone who trusts the morning to come, but the day had emptied him in a good way. The girl returned with a seriousness that made the neighbors on the sidewalk pause mid-conversation. She climbed onto the porch beside him, small fingers finding the blanket's familiar corner. "My turn," she whispered, voice as soft as a prayer. Very carefully, with the gravity of a tiny nurse and the generosity of a child, she shook the blanket open and laid it over Ranger's shoulders. The room-sewn piece that had always warmed someone smaller now warmed someone big. The rolls slid just like that. The one who had guarded was being guarded. Ranger closed his eyes the way a door closes on a long day. The block held its breath. A few people wiped their cheeks. The mother turned away for a second, hands over her mouth. Mrs. Alvarez's nostrils trembled. She took a stitch. By the second morning, Ranger had learned the routes of the house. He knew which floorboards whistled and where the sun poured through the kitchen window like syrup at 10. He stationed himself in the doorway of the girl's room while she played with blocks, watching the precarious towers and leaning in when a wall listed to one side, as if he could hold it up with hope alone. When she napped, he lay with his nose at the edge of the blanket she used for daytime sleep. A different blanket, lightweight, printed with yellow moons, but he kept the daisy-edged one in the basket by the bed, as if certain he might need to ferry it between grief and comfort at a moment's notice. Once, a delivery truck rumbled past too fast and rattled the windows. The little girl startled and reached out. Ranger stood and set his head gently on the mattress, and her hand, without opening her eyes, found the smooth slope between his ears. They both settled as if they'd rehearsed it. The neighborhood adjusted to the new rhythm. Children were taught to ask before petting, and they did, solemn as ceremony. Ranger, who had learned people by scent and suggestion, now learned them by voice, too. The hi, buddy, of a 6-year-old boy, the careful, hello, sir, of a shy girl who had never been allowed near big dogs before, the even, kind baritone of the pastor who brought a bag of old towels from the church. "Some for baths," he said, patting the top of the pile, "and some for picnics. Every family needs both." Ranger accepted them all, filing each new person into a map only dogs can read. In the afternoons, when the heat rose like a quiet tide from the sidewalks, the girl's father set up a small wading pool under the shade of the maple. The girl stomped and splashed, terrorizing precisely no one, while Ranger stood just outside the rim and watched, tail at half-mast, occasionally lowering his paw to test the water as if he might enroll himself too. When a stray tennis ball rolled under the hydrangea hedge, he retrieved it with the same careful mouth that had saved the blanket. He brought it to the pool and set it at the girl's feet, then blinked as she shrieked with delight. He blinked again when she tossed it clumsily, then blinked a third time when he trotted after it dutifully, as if learning a new language whose grammar was joy. The storm that had been promised by the weatherman never came, but a brief afternoon shower swept down the block 2 days later, quick and bright, leaving behind the smell of wet sidewalks and the sharp knock of drops from the maple's leaves. Ranger lifted his head at the first patter and checked the window with the alertness of someone for whom rain meant empty rooms and doors that shut behind heartbreak. The little girl crossed the living room, climbed onto the window seat, and patted the cushion. He hopped up, more gently than the cushion probably deserved, and she laid her hand on his shoulder. "No scary," she told the sky through the glass. "We're inside." It was absurd and perfect and exactly enough. Ranger huffed, settled his chin on the sill, and watched the rain diminish to nothing. Sometimes healing is not medicine but a sentence spoken with total conviction by someone who still believes the world will do as she says. By week's end, Ranger and the girl had built a glossary. Wait here meant watch the hallway while she put on mismatched shoes. Gentle meant accept a stuffed rabbit under his paw and pretend it was alive. Good night meant the new ritual, the basket carried from the porch to the foot of the girl's bed, the blanket lifted and shaken open, a fall of daisies, and tucked over Ranger's shoulders by hands that had learned exactly how to smooth the edges. In return, he had commands of his own, tail flicks that meant play, a huff that meant someone is at the door, an intense, unblinking stare that meant she is eating crayons again. The family learned them all and answered accordingly: fetch, greet, intervene. The town did its part too. Someone started leaving small bouquets of daisies on the porch rail. No note, just stems bound with string. The high school art teacher organized her after-school club to paint a little mural on the side of the fence. A field of daisies, a child, and a shepherd silhouetted under a big sky. The words some guardians carry memory. Some share it. The librarian set aside a stack of picture books about dogs for the girl, who read them to Ranger by turning pages and describing the pictures in earnest whispers. At closing time, she stamped each book with an invisible seal, a kiss pressed to Ranger's forehead. On the seventh night, after a day of ordinary miracles, no accidents on the rug, a nap that dovetailed with the mail delivery, a fetch game that lasted exactly 12 tosses, the porch lamp burned low and the house grew quiet. The little girl padded across the floor in socks with ducks on them, dragging the worn blanket carefully behind her, daisies whispering across the boards. She found Ranger already in his basket and knelt beside him, cheeks pink from bath heat, hair smelling faintly of apples. "Good night, Range," she breathed, the words so close to his nose they tickled. She shook the blanket like a small flag and laid it over his back, tucking the edges with a concentration that made the adults turn away again, struck dumb by the size of gentleness. Ranger opened his eyes just long enough to press his muzzle into her palm. A seal, a signature, a trust falling like a stamp on paper, then let them close. The girl lay down beside the basket and tucked her own hand under the blanket's corner, not to keep it from being taken, but to keep it shared. The house exhaled. Outside, somewhere down the block, laughter drifted up from a porch. Inside, a family and a dog slept under the same roof, the same threadbare blessing pulled over both. Even long after the streets of Maple Lane returned to their ordinary hum, the image of the shepherd with the blanket never left the town's memory. For some, it was a passing curiosity, a stray who clung to fabric as though it mattered. For others, especially the older residents, it became something else entirely, a reminder of what devotion looks like when stripped bare of words. A dog had carried a child's blanket through grief and rain and days without end, and though he had lost the baby he once guarded, he had not let go of his duty. To many, that single act said more about loyalty than a dozen sermons or speeches ever could. The little girl could not name such lessons, of course, but she lived them instinctively. Each evening she tucked the same blanket over Ranger, not because she had been taught to, but because her heart understood the rhythm of devotion. Give back what was once given, keep safe what once kept you. She didn't know she was embodying a wisdom that age sometimes erodes, the ability to see love not as possession but as presence, not as a word but as a gesture. The elders of the town, those who sat on porches with quilts over their knees, saw in Ranger's story a mirror of their own quiet faiths. They knew what it meant to hold on to something after loss. Letters, photographs, trinkets whose value lived in memory rather than market. The blanket became their symbol, too. It whispered a truth many of them had tried to pass to their grandchildren, that the most ordinary things can carry the weight of extraordinary love. Loyalty, the story showed, does not end when breath does. It lingers in paw prints across wet sidewalks, in frayed cloth carried carefully between teeth, in the long vigil of an animal who remembers even when the world has moved on. Where humans may stumble in their grief, animals often continue with a purity we forget. Ranger's refusal to surrender the blanket was not stubbornness but faith, that somewhere, somehow, the love bound into those threads would still matter. For the community, it became impossible not to reflect on the metaphors layered in the scene. The blanket was more than fabric. It was memory stitched into cotton, devotion clinging to color, hope refusing to unravel. It reminded everyone that we, too, carry our own blankets, keepsakes, scars, traditions that tether us to those we love. Sometimes we guard them so fiercely that others fail to understand, but like Ranger, we know their weight in our hearts. And yet, the story also carried a gentle invitation to see in loyalty not just grief but renewal. The dog who once clung to memory alone now had a child who reminded him that love could be lived forward, not only backward. The blanket no longer belonged to the past. It became part of a present where a little girl's hands offered trust and a town's arms offered welcome. In that transformation lay the deepest lesson, that devotion is not meant to imprison us in sorrow, but to guide us into new bonds, carrying memory as blessing rather than burden. For the seniors, the story touched a nerve deeper still. Many of them had lived through losses, friends gone, children grown, spouses passed. They recognized in Ranger's vigil what it feels like to hold onto symbols because the heart cannot bear emptiness. But they also saw in the little girl's kindness a medicine for that ache, the truth that compassion, especially from the young, can renew faith. They told their families over tea, "Animals show us devotion in ways we forget. Watch them, and you will remember what it means to love without condition." The town itself began to shift. A mural of daisies and a shepherd appeared on the library wall, painted by the high school art club, captioned simply, "Loyalty doesn't fade." The blanket was never displayed in a museum or glass case. It remained on the porch, sometimes folded, sometimes draped, sometimes tucked over the dog at night by the girl's sleepy hands. But everyone knew it was there, a relic not of tragedy but of endurance. The larger reflection, whispered from porch to porch, was this: loyalty is not a thing that time erases. It may change shape, may be carried in teeth or tucked under an arm, but it endures. It endures in the way a widow still makes her husband's favorite soup once a year, in the way a grandfather tells the same war story not for glory but for memory, in the way a shepherd clings to a blanket because it once carried a baby's scent. Love, when real, does not disappear. It settles into symbols, into rituals, into the marrow of living. And in that quiet realization, the town found comfort. The dog had taught them what no lecture could, that devotion is simple, wordless, often unseen until a child points it out. And sometimes, the truest miracles arrive not with thunder, but with the soft drag of fabric on morning pavement, witnessed by a girl small enough to still believe. So, if you are listening now, whether with years behind you or innocence still ahead, remember Ranger's blanket. Remember the way a child saw not a stray but a guardian. Remember that loyalty is not measured in grand gestures but in the small, stubborn act of carrying love forward. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in loyalty that never fades. For in telling it, you pass the blanket on, not of fabric, but of faith. As this chapter closes, we thank you for joining us. The journey doesn't end here. Stay tuned for more stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, take care and keep the magic alive.